America's public enemy number one is drug abuse.
Drugs.
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 There weren't any drug laws in the United States up until about the 1870s, so you could buy anything you wanted, any place you wanted. So the city of San Francisco in the 1870s enacted the first anti-opium laws. And the origins of that were very much rooted in race and racism, because the railroads had been recently finished. The Chinese laborers that had been brought in to work on those railroads were now competing with Irish immigrants and white immigrants for jobs during a recession. And so they looked for ways to control or oppress the targeted population, in this case, the Chinese immigrants. And so the city of San Francisco said there are these opium dens that Chinese men were going to lure white women into. And this happens over and over and over again in different drug scares. So put it another way, drugs are what other people use. What we use is normal. Tobacco is normal. Alcohol is normal. Those are the two most deadly drugs in our society today.
The objective of the drug war has been to create a drug-free society.
If someone offers you drugs, instead of saying something you really don't mean, just say no.
But there was really no way to attain that. One reason is that human beings have been using psychoactive drugs virtually throughout the world and virtually throughout history. So the notion that somehow we're going to eradicate these things and stop human beings from trying to alter their consciousness for better or for worse with drugs is simply absurd. The second thing is that so long as there is a demand for these substances, there will be a supply.
Yeah.
And if one way to think about the global markets in cannabis and coke and cocaine, in opium and heroin, is that they're essentially global commodities markets. If somehow that one source gets knocked out by a law enforcement effort, somebody else will pick up slack, just as happens with coffee or tea or any other type of commodity.
So much cocaine, we can't even tell you where we shot this video.
And doing that, trying to control it with law enforcement rather than intelligent regulatory apparatus.
Soften up, we got a warrant.
Is a recipe not just for failure, but for disaster.
Drug prohibition has made drugs more easy to obtain, of higher purity, and of lower price than ever before. And problematic drug use has been increasing. We had about 70,000 overdose deaths last year.
It's the modern day Al Capone and organized crime and violence and corruption and booming black markets and young people looking at bootleggers or drug traffickers as role models, and all the corruption and the killings and the drugs being adulterated and more dangerous, and all of those things are not the results of drugs. They're the results of a failed prohibitionist policy.
Just last month, 32 agencies of the United Nations came out in favor of decriminalization.
You know, the United States, our prison population, is the largest in the world, not just in absolute numbers, but also per capita. I mean, we lock up people at a higher rate than Russia and China, almost anywhere else. We lock up people at a rate that's 5 to 10 times the rate in European countries. I mean, it's a massive violation of human rights, and it's not something that we did throughout American history. It's a relatively modern phenomenon that just happened last few decades, and it was driven by the war on drugs. And where people who are arrested are treated in our criminal law like the rapists or murderers.
I think the fundamental concept upon which this country was founded upon was the right to be left alone, that enjoy some personal freedom, absent harm to others, and in a socially responsible way. Now, if you can't control what you do with your own body, if you can't decide what you put into your mouth, your lungs, your veins, your eyes, your any other orifice, you really don't control anything at all. You don't own anything if you don't own your own body. We've externalized a responsibility for this problem, right? So to blaming farmers, peasant farmers in South America for supplying the drugs when it's our people who are demanding it.
Through Iniciativa Mérida, Mexico has received around 300,000 million pesos.
We've tried to fight this on the supply side using very tough and brutal measures, but each time the drug economy is very resilient, and they find more efficient ways to counteract each of our policies.
We see smuggling activity via tunnels. We see in some locations we see ultralights, we see trebuchets or drug launchers and used by compressed air. So we see an array of methods where individuals are trying to smuggle narcotics across.
The cartels go into neighboring states such as Texas, Arizona, and buy legally guns. They disarm them, and piece by piece they come back in the border in Mexico, and that's the guns that they use in order to kill our people.
The drug prohibition is like setting up an X prize for drug traffickers. If you can find a way to penetrate our borders, you stand to make not just millions, but billions of dollars. We have scorched millions of acres of Colombia, for instance, using spray planes to try to destroy coca bushes on the ground. And there's more cocaine than ever coming out of Colombia. So this is not working.
When you see there's some parts of Bolivia and Peru where they allow coca to be produced legally, my regret there is that there's not more sophisticated international advocacy to push for the legalization of coca in global markets. So it's really trying to introduce, really to shift the country and to some extent the world from drug policies grounded in ignorance, fear, prejudice, and profit to drug policies grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights. So when I began my work in the late 1980s, and even the early 90s, maybe 25% of the American population supported legalizing marijuana, and nobody had legalized it anywhere.
Our goal is a drug-free society.
And by the time I stepped down, 55 to 60% of Americans supported legalizing marijuana for all adults. 85% supported legalizing it for medical purposes. 30-something states have legalized medical marijuana with a doctor's recommendation.
The Justice Department issued new guidelines today on prosecuting people who distribute or use medical marijuana.
And 8 states, including California, the biggest state, have legalized it for all adults.
California is going to vote on legalizing possession of small amounts of marijuana.
So we're going through an evolution now, but by and large what we're doing is we're seeing a drop in marijuana arrests. By and large, we have not seen any real jump in marijuana consumption by adolescents, which is good.
We have increased the safety of the cannabis supply on the streets, particularly in places like Colorado, which has been the longest operating legal system. And Colorado has stopped many batches of cannabis from reaching the market because they've tested the supply. And they said, no, you've been found with traces of banned pesticides. We're rejecting this.
The biggest increase in marijuana consumption is among older people. It's among people my age, people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, who either have not been using cannabis ever or have not used it in decades and are now using it sometimes for quasi-medicinal ways. Using it instead of alcohol, using it instead of an antidepressant, using it instead of other sorts of things like that. So we do see cannabis use increasing. The nature of consumption is shifting from smoking, joints or bongs or whatever, to now doing more edible forms and vaping, and that's generally a positive thing for public health.
There's also the tax revenue, which has been considerable. That should not be the reason to legalize, but it's a very good fringe benefit.
This town of 5,300 is generating $1.4 million in sales tax revenue from pot. That's 20% of its annual budget.
So Colorado has been able to use a lot of that revenue for education and other purposes, and prevention and research.
What I like about the Portugal approach, because they didn't fully legalize drug possession. They said, we're not going to put anybody in jail for simple drug possession, right? If somebody's possessing, using drugs, and they don't have a problem, we'll give them a lecture, we'll see if they have problems, and then we'll tell them to go away and not get caught again.
It's easy to them to get to us and say, okay, I have a drug problem and I need help. They don't have to lie to us. it's like, okay, I'm using, and I'm not afraid to get in jail or something like that. And I think this is a big difference, you know.
If they have a problem, right, we're not going to use the taxpayers' resources to lock people up, right? And if they're really a bad guy, we'll catch them for something else and put them in jail for that.
So in Vancouver and British Columbia, there are they have a tremendous fentanyl adulteration problem there, lots of overdoses, but they also have number one, a safe injection site called Insight. It's been operating for about 15 years now, and there are many of these around the world, supervised consumption centers, where no one has ever died of an overdose in a supervised consumption center around the world, and there have been millions of injections of drugs. So that's very important.
Heroin, a drug that's so addictive, once you're hooked, getting off can be near impossible. That's why some doctors say when nothing else works, we should be prescribing hardcore addicts the very drug they're hooked on, heroin. It might seem crazy, but it works in Europe. And for the first time, it's about to happen in Canada.
And so that keeps them alive until such time as they're ready to give up. And some may never give up, but what's keeping them alive, because the most valuable thing, the most important thing, is that they remain alive.
So when I look into heroin maintenance programs in Switzerland and Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, Canada, those are good models. Well, the question for me is, those programs, research shows, have been enormously successful in helping both the people who use heroin, reducing crime and disease and overdose and all these other things. So the question is, how do we take those very successful programs and scale them up so that a growing proportion of the people who are using these drugs get them from legal sources and do so in a way that does not invite a much bigger drug abuse problem in our society. And then, of course, there's also the psychedelics, right? MDMA and the psychedelics. And that's its own special category, right? Because these are drugs which, by and large, very few people get addicted to. These are drugs in which the benefit of the substances relative to the harms of the substance is probably the greatest of all.
There is tremendous potential and research being done right now, including with government approval. The U.S. government has approved the research around MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder and for end-of-life issues. Psilocybin mushrooms are also being tested with government approval for cancer patients facing end-of-life issues, and it's helped them tremendously.
The ultimate objective is twofold. It is to reduce both the harms of drugs and the harms of drug control or drug prohibitionist policies. And it does mean that the way we regulate marijuana is going to be different than the way we regulate psychedelics. It's going to be different from the way we regulate low-potency cocaine. It's going to be different from the way we regulate high-potency cocaine, et cetera, et cetera.
I would say that anyone who wants drugs can already get drugs. So people who want to use drugs are using drugs. And we're exposing those people to higher risks and higher harm because of the black market nature of the system. And it's not preventing people from using drugs. So why not have a regulated system that makes it much safer and much more orderly and deprives organized crime from a lot of the revenue?